Welcome everybody. Today we're going to look at Node.js as a development environment, and a couple notes before we get started. One is that all the samples that I'm going to walk through and the slides for this are going to be available to you. If I move over to this GitHub repo here and just take a quick look, you can see that there are slides both in PPTX and PDF format at the top level, and in the demo folder we have a bunch of Node.js projects that I'm going to be demoing as we go through this next hour. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to just start with a quick introduction to Node.js and Node Package Manager so everyone has a good idea of where these things came from and what we use them for. And then we're going to go through some typical development, and we're going to look at one project where we're going to use a utility called Gulp. And Gulp is this task runner that helps us automate things in the development workflow, such as running a compiler to compile TypeScript code into JavaScript code, or to copy files to a distribution folder. We're also going to then look at Webpack. Webpack is getting to be more and more popular in the development tools that we use on the Microsoft stack. So we're going to take a look at just Webpack in and of itself just to get a good idea of what it is. Now, when we get to section number 4, that's probably going to be the most fun, where we're going to start mixing this Node.js style development and creating something pretty neat with React.js. And we're going to be using TypeScript and Webpack behind the scenes. And then one of the motivations that I have to teach people to use Node.js is that there are two Microsoft frameworks, the SharePoint Framework and the Custom Visuals Framework for Power BI, where the creators of these frameworks made the decision that we're going to build our framework on top of Node.js. So you have to learn Node.js just to be a SharePoint Framework developer or to develop custom visuals for Power BI. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. So we have one of our uber geeks in our industry, and a guy named Ryan Dahl. In 2009, he created what we think of as Node.js. Now, he had this problem where he was using Apache HTTP server, and as the number of users who hit his web server went up, he found that he could not scale. Now, what Node.js really is, it's an execution environment, and it's based on a JavaScript engine that was made by Google, which is known as the V8 engine. So Ryan was experimenting by taking JavaScript code and executing it to basically create a server-side application, and he came up with this ingenious idea that with a single thread, you could basically make an off-host call to something like SQL Server, but yet not block the thread. The thread could go about to handle other incoming requests, and when the callback came, because we have a query return from something like SQL Server, he had an event-based paradigm. And so what he was able to do is create a very efficient single-threaded non-blocking server. Okay, now the story gets a lot more complicated. Now, when we look at what is Node.js, it is a JavaScript runtime based on the Google V8 engine. And so it can be used as a development environment to create code that's going to run on a web server or a development machine. So sometimes we want to create code that runs on the server with JavaScript and push it out in an application. And other times, and this is mainly for SharePoint Framework and creating custom visuals, we simply use this runtime as a development environment so we can run all these different tools. And by the time we're done and we package our application and we ship it, Node.js isn't required anymore. Okay, so once again, what are the primary motivations that people have for using Node.js? And for some, it's server-side development with web applications and web services. Okay. It just turns out that I happen to use Node.js in environments where we don't really care about the web application or web service unless we're in the development environment where we want to be able to have a web server so we can kind of run, test, and debug our code. Okay. Now, first you have to install Node.js. Pretty straight ahead. It's a free environment. And once you install it, we're going to start using it. And Node.js pretty much is going to support any type of development environment except for Visual Studio. So for various reasons, Visual Studio, the thing that many people have used for the last 10 or 20 years, just basically has proprietary file and folder structures and just does not fit in very well with the way that the Node.js development framework grew. Now, Microsoft created Visual Studio Code, which has a really good fit with doing Node.js style development. Now, let's go ahead and I'm going to jump to our first demo. And so what I'm going to do is there is this folder that I have. And so this folder, as you can see here, is hello Node.js. And I'm going to go ahead, right-click, and open this up with Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code kind of gets the idea that when you open something, you open a folder, and there are Node.js project files that we're going to see in just a second. So for instance, I now have this package.json file. Let's say that I delete that file. And now what we're going to do is we're going to call this package manager, which is called npm. So if I say node package manager, and I call this command called init, and then I'm going to pass -y to basically say, if you're going to ask me questions, just take the default answer. And so I'll go ahead and run this right here, and notice that it creates a package.json file. So one of the things that I would say is that, how do I tell if it's a Node.js project? If it has a package.json file at the root, it's basically managed by the Node package manager, npm. Now, in our case right here, let's say we want to do hello world. Now, here's the only piece of server-side code I'm going to be demoing through this whole 1-hour talk. Just to kind of have this proof of concept that here I am at the terminal. Let me go ahead and put in a command. So this is a JavaScript file named server.js. And if I wanted to execute this through the Node.js JavaScript runtime, we're going to call Node. Once we call Node, I'm going to do a // If I hit the tab key, I should be able to find that particular file and hit enter. Okay, so now what happened is we basically started a web server, and we're now listening on port 3000. Okay, let's go ahead, and I'm going to bring up this browser, and if I now kind of type in HTTP and then localhost, and now 3000, what's going to happen is I'm going to hit this web server right here, and each time I go ahead and click on this, what you can see a refresh, it's coming back here and executing this. Okay, so this gives us the ability to create web servers and web services that can pretty much do anything. Okay, I'm not going to use server-side code anymore, but I just wanted to point out that that is a whole world for other developers other than me in using Node.js for that style of server-side development. Okay, now, what we just looked at was using npm init, and that's how to initialize a project, and you get a package.json file. Okay, at this point, I haven't had to include any packages because I just wanted to use the Node.js runtime, and you can see that, what I've used here just is natively supported. Okay, but now what we want to do is we want to install other packages. So let's say I want to install something which is called browser sync. Now, just as an example, let's say I go back and I take a particular project. So for instance, I've got this project right here, and I'll just call this one project 1. And when I open up project 1, I basically look, and we have an HTML file, we have a JavaScript file, and we have some CSS. So what I'd like to be able to do is to basically test this out. And what I need is I need a local web server. And so what's really nice is that there's all these different packages, and what we're going to do is we're going to install a particular package, which is browser sync. Now, before I do that, let's use npm, and I want to do a install, and let's say I install a library like jQuery, something simple. Okay, so we go ahead and we run this right here, and what we're going to see is that we get a package.json file, which gets created. Okay, now when I look at this particular file, let me do one more thing here. I want to go back and call that, but this time I'm going to, after npm I or npm install, and then the package name jQuery, we have a hyphen hyphen, and then we're going to say save hyphen dev. Okay, now when I run this right here, let's get rid of this here. So I can open up my project right here. What we're going to see, okay, somehow I've confused this. What I'm going to do one more time is call npm and init and hyphen y. Okay, somehow I deleted my package.json file. But what I wanted you to see here is that there is a dependency, and the idea is that when you install packages, you basically want to document the fact that the package is part of your project. And also, when we take our project and we check it into source code, you're going to have all these project dependencies, all these files that you don't want to store. You just basically want to pull them down when you need them. Now, one of the things that you'll see is that when you install a package, they create a Node modules folder. Now, let's say that I go back and I delete the Node modules folder. So let's go back here, go ahead, choose delete. And what I want to show here now is that if we look at the command line, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in npm and either install or just I will do the same trick. The idea is that it's going to look through the project, or the package.json file, and it's going to find whatever it needs, and it's going to go ahead and restore what's in Node modules. Okay, now let's do the same thing. Except now, what we're going to do is we're going to not install something simple like jQuery. We're going to install this other utility, which is the browser-sync. Okay, so let's go ahead and install that. And what's neat about using browser sync is that it provides a web server, which makes it easy to kind of start up your project and see your HTML file running inside the browser, typically at a address of localhost inside there. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out is I added one particular package, but now one of the things that you can see is that how many packages really got added? 316. So if I add a package that depends on 2 other packages, and those 2 depend on 10 other packages, which depend on 100 other packages, you have these trees, and the idea is that you need every single dependent package, even though it might be a grandchild or a great-grandchild dependency. And once again, if I go back and I take a look at my folder that I've created right here, how big is the Node modules directory going to get? It's already 35 megabytes. When you create a SharePoint Framework solution project, the default Node modules folder is about 400 megabytes in size. So just to give you a comparison, these things get pretty big, which is why we like to be able to delete them before we check them into source code. And the idea is that once you open a project, so for instance, if you look at all the different projects that I've included, let's go to this one which is called the, the bean counter. And I'm going to right-click this one. And the idea is that once you open up a project, before you can do anything, the first thing that you're going to want to do is do an npm install, because that's basically going to restore all the different packages that this project depends on. And generally, nothing will work until you do the npm install, and then things should work just fine after that. Okay, so let's go a little further in the slides. So we've talked about the Node modules folder. We've talked about configuring this server-side web server by installing browser sync. Okay, now let's say that I wanted to start that up. I could do something like call browser sync start. Once again, if I go back here, and if we've got browser sync installed, we should be able to, as you see here in the slides, browser sync. So that is a command line utility. And what gets to be really big with Node.js is once you install a package, it has a command line utility, and you can start calling it from the command line of your project. Okay, so in our case right here, if I call browser-sync and I go to the right directory and and now we'll call start, and then we want server equals and distribution. Okay, and the whole the whole idea there is it just starts running your project inside here. So you have this web server, and note if we go a little bit further here, let's say that we go ahead and stop. You got to get used to having the console, which is blocked on your running web server, which is your debugging environment, and being able to stop it. So holding down the control key and hitting C and terminating that, is important. And you'll find that sometimes it just doesn't work, and you kind of keep clicking on the console until you finally get it right. But once again, this is kind of something we get used to. Now, a second thing that I want to see here is that one of the things that we can do is we can also add a watch. And the idea of a watch is that, let's go ahead and run this right here. The idea of having a file watch is that when we're developing, let's go back to our code, let's go open up the CSS, and here is orange. And let's bring this forward and see if I can kind of show them both on the same screen at the same time. Okay, and I go ahead and change that to red, and I go ahead and hit save. And what you can see is that there's a file watch mechanism so that when one of my source files changes, and because I've saved the file, it, in this case, is just refreshing the browser. As we get a little bit further into it, that change in file and its detection and running code will result in rebuilding any parts of your project that are necessary, to kind of see the results of what you've just done. Okay, now let's go a little further. And one of the things that we often have to work with in Node.js development, especially if we're using SharePoint Framework or Power BI Custom Visuals, is that we're going to be writing code in TypeScript, and our TypeScript has to be compiled into JavaScript. And so inside your package, whether you ever come face to face with it or not, there's going to be a call to the TypeScript compiler. So your project is going to have TypeScript as one of the packages. When we work with frameworks like the SharePoint framework and the custom visual tools, you don't have to add support, it's there. But one of the things that you're going to see is that there's an important file which is called a tsconfig file. And the tsconfig file controls basically what goes on during compilation. Now here's just an example of what a tsconfig file might look like. Okay, now in the next example, I'm going to go ahead and move back here. And I'm going to go ahead and maybe close things so I only have one instance of this tool open at once. Okay, and the next project we want to go look at is going to be working with Gulp. Now, what is Gulp? Gulp is a Node.js package that someone created to basically execute JavaScript for tasks that do things while you're doing development. So the obvious example would be compiling TypeScript into JavaScript. And sometimes it's just moving files from one place to another. Okay, now since I opened this project, I'm going to do an npm I to install this. And in our case right here, what we'd like is we'd like to have this build process where we have the code that we're writing, all the code that we're using to author this solution, are built out inside the source folder, while everything else is going to be pushed inside the dist folder. Now, when you use Gulp, one of the things that you'll see is that you're going to be writing JavaScript, and it runs just right here in your development environment. And the idea is that we're now using the JavaScript execution environment to help us automate building our project, the workflows to take it from kind of dev into a package production application. Now, note that this form of JavaScript supports what's called modules, and so I can call a method called require, which is going to point to, basically an object defined with JavaScript and load it into this environment. Now, when I have Gulp, I'm going to create tasks. So let's start with the first task, which is clean. And note that after you've written these Gulp scripts, you're going to be able just to type in Gulp and then the name of a task. For instance, we have a task called clean. Now, the way it works is that you'll run Gulp commands from the root folder. And in the root folder has to be a file named gulpfile.js. And inside of this file, you will call Gulp task to create tasks that are identified by a string name. And when you call them, it'll execute code. So let's say we want to go ahead and do a clean. So the idea is that every time we do a build, we want to build out the dis folder. But the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and delete it. And note that with Gulp, you have this idea of a source folder or a source file, and then you have a destination. And we're able to use something which is called a pipe, to move something from a source to a destination, and in some cases to kind of clean out the destination. Now, let's look at build. So now what we'd like to do, after we've done a clean, we want to call build. And also note that when you create Gulp, and this syntax changed with Gulp 4, and this is Gulp 4, note that you can say Gulp series, and before we run the build task, we want to first run a dependent task, which is clean. Okay, now I don't have to run clean anymore because I can just run build. And here we're going to copy HTML and CSS and PNG files, and then here's some code that is going to trigger the compilation of my project's TypeScript into JavaScript. And note that there is a tsconfig file involved inside here too. So the idea is if we now call Gulp build and we go ahead and run this right here, it should basically build my entire project. And now I have this dis folder right here. And at first it was empty, but then I ran these Gulp tasks. Now let's go a little bit further here. So now let's say that I have a Gulp start. And not only do I want to copy all the source files and compile the TypeScript into JavaScript, when we're all done, we want to call that browser sync utility. The reason I use browser sync in this demo is because it's very Gulp friendly. Okay, so now what we're going to do, let's go back up here and I'll go ahead and clear that out. We're going to go ahead and do a Gulp start. And so the idea is it should build a project and then basically run it inside of the browser. Now, we haven't yet gotten any type of file watching working. So we're going to do one more thing, and that is we're going to add a new Gulp task called refresh, which is going to basically reload the browser. Then we're going to create a final Gulp task, which is called Gulp serve. And the idea is this thing will call start, and then it will basically add a watch, Gulp watch, and basically look at every single file in that source directory. And if any of those change, go ahead and trigger the refresh. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try to kind of run our final product right here. Excuse me. And we're going to do a Gulp serve. Note that I kind of use Gulp serve because that's just what SharePoint Framework uses in its Gulp tasks. But now the project starts up, and now let's go back and take one of our particular files and change that to a better color. And once again, we should be able to make this change here. Let's go ahead and do a file save. And then after making that change, if I've done everything correctly, okay, somehow things weren't changing there. Maybe I did not do it correctly. Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure, but what I was trying to do is get file watch working, which if I didn't get working, it was my fault. The product definitely does it just fine. Okay, let's keep going through here. And we just looked at automating a build with Gulp. Now, Gulp is a common tool, and the idea is you have all kinds of things that you want to do, maybe beyond just TypeScript compiling. Do you want to minify something? Do you want to go ahead and, run any type of process, as you're taking the CSS, maybe your CSS isn't in a CSS file, it's in an SCSS file or a .less file, so there are other compilers or transformers, that can basically change, from one language into another. Okay. Now, we're going to now move ahead to Webpack. Webpack, in our case, is going to replace what we were doing with Gulp in that last demo. So Webpack is a bundling utility. And the idea is that your project has 1,000 source files that go into creating this web application. But when I finally build the final files for release, I want to reduce the number of files as much as possible. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could take 1,000 JavaScript or TypeScript files, and put them into a single .js file? And that's one of the things that Webpack can do. Okay, not to oversell Webpack, but not only can it take all the TypeScript and JavaScript and put it in a single .js file, inside that file, it can also pack all your CSS styles, and it can even take images and basically turn them into stringified versions that can basically don't have to be deployed as individual image files, but can be stringified and just added inside of the JS file as well. Okay, now let's go ahead and open this next solution. And so this one is going to be the Webpack demo. And what I've tried to do is make it kind of as simple as possible for our first demo here. And one thing that's different than Gulp is that instead of putting all the code, inside of a single TypeScript file, we're going to start using something that's very common, which is dynamic module loading. So when we see TypeScript or more recent versions of JavaScript that have the import statement, the idea is that I can have this TypeScript file, quote.ts, and then I can have a second TypeScript file, and I can say import. So basically, we're recognizing types across source files by using the import statement. Now, what's really neat about this is that when we kind of look at the compiler, we're going to point to one file, app.ts. And app.ts has import statements to reference other files, and there might, in those files, be import statements to reference other files. And so there's this dependency tree. And so modern compilers and tools, know how to trace and basically, pull in that entire tree. This is one of the areas where Visual Studio just completely falls over. Whenever you go to projects that need dynamic module loading, you generally have to go to some type of Node.js, design, and using Webpack is getting to be more and more popular. So the idea is that not only can Webpack do the compilation, it's able to deal with some of the more modern libraries that we have. And the other neat thing is that a library might be huge, but you can only import a small number of types out of it. So by using Webpack, we can kind of really reduce the amount of JavaScript just by getting rid of, all the code and libraries that we never touch and never use. Okay, so now let's go ahead and, see how the pieces fit together. Webpack has loaders and it has plugins. Now, loaders came first, and they do two different things. So they identify which files, need to be transformed. So basically there is going to be a TypeScript file that needs to be transformed into a JavaScript file. Okay. And after they decide which files need to be transformed, they actually have the code that does the transformation. Okay. Now, let's go back into our project, and we're going to look at package.json. Now, here what you can see is that we have a couple different loaders in place. Okay. Now, also, when we start using Webpack, there is this special configuration file, which is the webpack.config.js file. Let's go ahead and open this thing up. So this basically says when we start compiling code, let's start at app.ts. And when we're all done, we're going to create something which is called bundle.js. Now down here, under modules, you can see these rules. So if a file has a TS extension, run it through a loader which is called the TypeScript loader. Okay. Now actually, there's two different packages. One is called the TypeScript loader, and the other is called the awesome TypeScript loader. Which one do you think you should use? Okay, so I picked the awesome TypeScript loader. Now here, we also have loaders for CSS. And one of the things that we're going to be able to do is take the CSS inside of our project. Let's go back here and kind of, here is some CSS. Let's go back to our application file and look at this line right here. And the idea is that Webpack just figures out how to take my CSS, push it into the .js file, and going just a little bit further, if I have something where I'm referencing an app icon, and now application.ts has imported this CSS file, it's going to basically take this image and turn it into a string, so it can basically put it in the .js file as well. Okay. Now, in addition to these loaders, there's also plugins. It's a little bit confusing because we probably should just have either loaders or plugins, but in earlier versions of Webpack, we had loaders, and everything worked with loaders, and then we had a new major version came out. They introduced plugins that are more capable, but there are certain loaders, that did everything we needed to, and then we created new plugins, so we kind of have a little bit of both inside there. But down here, if I go back, into our file, you can see that, we have a plugin which is going to basically just delete what's ever in the dist folder. Another one which is going to take HTML index, throw it across. And let's go back here and let's do a npm run and build. And note that with all the Webpack projects that I have, if you look inside of package.json, there are two named scripts, one build, one start. And when I run build, it's just going to call Webpack right here. Okay, now what I wanted to show here is if I go ahead and I do a run build, it's basically going to build out this folder, this dist folder inside here, and then let's have a quick look inside there. So I go back into my project, and here's the dist folder. And so how many files are we deploying? Basically, bundle.js and index.html. Now the favicon.ico file can't be bundled up inside there because it has to be seen by the browser. But what you've seen is we've reduced as many TypeScript and CSS files down to a single bundle.js file. Okay, now going a little bit further here, Webpack, when we use it, and let's go back, and what I want to do is I want to go down to, sorry about this, let me get rid of the node modules folder, and open up the package.json folder. Now, when we use Webpack, we basically need the package Webpack, and as of Webpack 4, we start using the Webpack CLI. It is messy to move between versions of Webpack because there's a bunch of things that you have to change, but this is, shows you how to do it at the most recent version. Now, Webpack also comes with a development server. So we were using browser sync in the last example, but now Webpack comes with its own server. So let's go ahead and do a npm run, and this time we're going to do run start. And once again, here, this is just a command line utility, and we're calling Webpack dev server and open. And let's go ahead and run this right here. And let me take this. Things are now running. let's now go back, into one of our source files, and inside of our source file, let's go ahead and make a change inside there. And as I make this change and hit save, what you can see is behind the scenes, it's rebuilding and basically refreshing the browser. Now, one thing that's very strange, took me a while to get this about the Webpack dev server, is that it doesn't write files to disk. It basically just puts out all files in memory. And what's really neat about that is that it doesn't have to rebuild the entire project, but when you update a file, it has a dependency tree, so it knows which files it has to update and which parts of the build and deploy process it has to go through. So the larger your project gets, the more important it is to have a very efficient tool, such as Webpack doing these. Okay, everyone's having fun. Let's keep going. And so now that we've kind of looked at, how Webpack helps out, let's introduce something new. We've talked about Webpack and TypeScript. So now let's start using a very popular library, which is called React.js. And what I find is that to use React.js with TypeScript just can't really be done in Visual Studio. You need Visual Studio Code, or some other tool that understands Node.js development because of the dynamic loading of these modules. Now, I'm going to open up 2 test projects. So let's go ahead and close everything here. And the next project we're going to look at is going to be the one that has a very simple React project, but it basically introduces this project structure that has Webpack, as the builder and the Webpack dev server, and then all our code is going to be written with TypeScript, or TypeScript not in a TS file, but a TSX file. Okay, now let's go ahead and I'm going to do an npm I, to make sure that all the dependencies are there. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and do a npm run start, and that's going to start the project up. And as we start the project up, this is just a pretty simple hello world style application. Now, what is React? React is a library for building user interface experiences. I want to do something like build a wizard so that when a new customer comes and we have to ask them 10 questions, and as they answer question 2, we then have to ask question 3 a different way. So having React, to build a user experience, through some type of a, shopping cart or a series of questions, gets to be a natural thing to do. Now, React is used by the SharePoint Framework. So if you're using SharePoint Framework, you have kind of an extra motivation for working with React. Now, React has a popular technology which is known as JSX, which is basically writing JavaScript with the ability to embed HTML right inside of your JavaScript. And because we're not using JavaScript, we're using TypeScript, we have TSX files, not JSX files. Now, let's go look at an example of a TSX file. So if I go back here and I kind of look at the application, note that in React, we have a class that we create, and I'll just call mine app, and it extends, and in the React library, there is React component. And you can see down here that I can define what the HTML looks like. If this is up here, and you can kind of see demo 1, let me go ahead and make a big change. I'll change that to demo 1, and that kind of triggers recompile. So you can see you have a pretty quick way to be able to change things inside here. And just to put in one more, let's say that now what I want to do is talk about how to design React components. And there is this very important concept that a React component can have state and properties. So let's go through the next couple slides and we'll kind of walk through that. So when you create a React component in TypeScript, you create a class that inherits from React.component, and the only requirement is that you have to have a render method. Now, properties are things that are initialized, not by the component, but by the kind of parent component that creates the component. And properties are going to look a lot like HTML attributes. Okay, and properties are read-only. Now, we also have state. And the idea of state is a component decides what things affect its rendering. And so we design the state. Let's go back here and kind of take a look at this example. So we have this bean counter. And so the bean counter is going to have a starting number. But it also has a count. And the idea is that anytime the count increments, we need to re-render. Okay, so we have this render method. And inside the render method, we've defined state. I'm moving a little quick here. Let me kind of slow down just for a second to say that the way we do this in TypeScript is we define an interface for the component properties. And we pass that as a first typed parameter to the base class when we inherit. Also note that if you want your component to have state, you define an interface and you pass that as the second. Note that if you don't want to use any of this, you can basically define your components, by saying any, or some people do the exact same thing just by putting in a blank object. Okay, but once we want to start using kind of the way that we're supposed to design things, we're going to basically define interfaces for the property and one for the state. Now you can see that the bean counter has this property of start count. Also, if I go back here to the creator app, you can see that when it creates a new bean counter component, it just treats it like an HTML tag. And then here's the property, and we basically initialize it with a certain value. Now, in the component itself, we're going to have this code right here. And notice that we have this event handler. When I click on this button, this event handler is going to run. And it's going to call this method called addNewBean. And the idea is that when addNewBean runs, it's going to change the state. So this code will say set state, and note that if you have state that has 10 properties, you don't have to reassign all of them, just the one you're interested in setting a new value for. And whenever we call set state, that triggers render to run again. And so when again, in a very simple way, I'll go ahead and click this, and each time we're clicking this right here, you can see things running inside. Okay. One other cool point is that there is a development extension for Chrome for React tooling, and it's created by the people created the React tools. So if I go back here and I just have installed this extension and then I go to developer tools, I should be able to bring up the React component here, connecting to React. Hey, there's my app. Well, my app doesn't have any properties or state, but now here's the bean counter, and over here you can kind of see the properties and state. Okay, now that you've seen some of the basics, and you've kind of seen that when you define a React component, you define properties, you define state, let's go ahead and look at kind of a larger project. Now, this next project, if you've just, if you're brand new to TypeScript and to Webpack and everything else, this project is going to be a lot. However, you can just open it up and follow the steps to run it. So let's go ahead, and the main project that we have that does something interesting, let me make sure we close the folder there. Let's go back to open folder, is going to be the React customer search. So let's go ahead and run this in here. And note that this is kind of a larger React project. And first thing that you do to run this project is do npm I, and that's going to basically do the install and fill out the node modules folder. And then if I open up the package.json file here, what you can see is that there are two commands. So there's npm run build and npm run start. And if all I want to do is test out the application, we're going to do an npm run start. Okay, and if I do this right here, it should basically run my project. And when this project loads in, I just kind of wanted to show kind of having a customer search screen and being able to kind of have a search inside here. Note that if you load and run this project, it's actually going to be making calls across the network, to a web service. So I have a demo web service that's open with anonymous access. But you can kind of see that calling across the network is still pretty punchy inside there. Now, if I kind of move back and let's one more time go to the developer tools, and let's go to the React developer tools and kind of step down and kind of see, well, there's the app and there's this switch statement and you have different routes, and we're at the customer route, and you can kind of see that, as we designed the customer object and the, customer toolbar, so these are just lots of different React components, that we have used, to build out a real application. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to go into it much more because there's two more sections we want to get onto, but this is a real project. You could basically fire up, test it out, and, maybe that will be your motivation to start learning more about, how to work with React. And to me, working with React with TypeScript and Webpack, is going to give you a much better experience than working with React and JavaScript. And also, if you kind of follow this example, you're going to be using React the exact way you should be using it in SharePoint Framework when you add a React component web part. Okay. Note that the demo also involves the React router. So if I kind of just quickly step through this, note that up top, we've kind of created this routing scheme. So we can kind of go from node to node, and up top here, note that if I go from customers to about, you can kind of see that at the end of the screen. So just a quick look at how that's done. When we create the application object, what you'll see is that it's created inside of a router. There's a couple different types of routers. I just happen to pick the hash router for this demo. But now inside of the app object, we have this switch statement inside here. Now, if I go up to the top here, note that because we have these different packages like the React router DOM, and there are functions, those have to be imported. Once you've imported switch, I can now define different routes that we have inside there. And once we get to these individual other components, for the home component, and we open that up. Okay, so once again, this can kind of show you how to get started with, simple routing. Note that simple routing is pretty simple. As you get more advanced, routing gets to be pretty doggone tricky. Okay, so now that we've kind of had a look at React, what I want to do is, got about 12 minutes left, gives me kind of 6 minutes for each of these next two topics. So let's say that I want to develop with SharePoint Framework. So SharePoint Framework is going to be all about Node.js style development. Now, when I have Node.js and I want to work with SharePoint Framework, you need to install Gulp. And note that when you see Gulp commands with the -G, it means you're doing a global install, which means you don't have to be in a project folder to be able to call it. You can just call it from just the Node.js command prompt. Okay, you also have to install the Yeoman template generator, known as Yo. Okay, and then the idea of the Yeoman template generator is that if you have project templates, you can use them to basically, create a new folder for a project using that template. So the SharePoint Framework team has shipped a project template, and you have to install that with a, install global @ Microsoft /generator-SharePoint. Now, once you've done that, you can basically call this command, yo, and pass the the name of the template. So as a, for instance, let's say that we open up a new folder. So we'll do something like MD and my SPFx project. And so we create a folder, we move over to that folder, and now that we've done that, we're going to basically run this template generator to basically fill this folder full of stuff. Okay, let's do something fun. Let's do a code dot, and we'll go ahead and open up this first so we can kind of see the project as it's being built. Okay, and now back here, we'll go ahead and do the yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. Now, when we do this, and I didn't need the C in the front, let's try that one more time. It's going to start asking me a series of questions. What is your solution name? I'll just hit enter to take the project. You can just hit enter for most of these. In fact, I'm just going to hit enter for all of them. And when you get through all the different questions right here, what you'll see is it starts building out this project for you. And the project has a certain structure. And behind the scenes, they're using Gulp. So they're going to be Gulp commands that we can execute. Now, early in this webinar, I showed you, how we could create Gulp commands and then execute them. As a SharePoint Framework developer, you might just be the consumer of Gulp tasks that were basically written by the SharePoint Framework team and baked into the projects that you're going to be working with. You have to get up to an intermediate to advanced level before you'd either start modifying their Gulp tasks or adding your own Gulp tasks, into the set of tasks that come with a project. Now, once the project gets created inside here, let's go back here, and I'm going to take a quick look at this project. And if I look at this project right here, and we kind of look at the default size, okay, well, the SharePoint Framework team actually got it skinnier than before. It used to be 520, and now they've gotten it down to 381. But that's pretty big for the default size. Now, I've got something that I created, a very simple project, and this is part of your solution, and it's called my SPFx solution. And let's go ahead and notice that there's things like a TypeScript file. There is also a CSS file. It doesn't have a CSS extension. It has an CSS extension. So it's kind of a more flexible syntax than CSS, but it gets reduced to CSS as part of the compilation. And then there's a manifest file. But if I want to test things, I can do things like gulp build. And once again, every SharePoint Framework project just has the gulp build command built right into it. Let's say I want to test my project. There is a gulp serve command. And just like many of the things I've done before today, when I call gulp serve, something starts up a web server inside of the local Node.js environment. Now, for SharePoint Framework components, they bring up this special thing called the workbench, and that allows you to take web parts and add them in and start doing things, such as having properties and being able to kind of change properties and just see how your web part kind of adapts to that. Okay, so I didn't want to spend too long on SharePoint Framework because we just have a couple minutes here. And what I want to do is kind of end up just with a really quick look at developing custom visuals for Power BI, just to kind of prove that it too is something which is entirely based on Node.js development. Now, there is a tool which is called PBI Viz. So one of the things that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to install the tools. And once you install the Power BI developer tools, you'll have the PBI Viz utility. Now, let's say that I go back and I have a particular project. And with this project right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a visual project. And what we're going to do is we're going to call PBI Viz. And notice that, what version of this tool am I using? We've just, over the last 2 weeks, shipped version 3. And so one of the things I have to say is that version 2 and version 3 are completely different in how your project gets created and what version of TypeScript. So we're going to look at version 3 here. If you don't know the difference between the versions, use version 3. If you've created things in version 2, you do have a motivation to move over to version 3. Now, we're going to call PBI Viz new, and then you put the name of your project, Viz 01. And we go ahead and run this right here, and it creates this new project. And so after it creates the project, let's go ahead and move over to that folder. And now we're going to say code space dot and open this up. And here's what a new visual project looks like. Now, when I want to run this right here, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the terminal. And then once again, we're going to call PBI Viz start. And as I call PBI Viz start, it should basically compile my code. Now, if you start using this, one step that I kind of skipped over, let me go back to the slides, is that after you install the developer tools, you're going to have to install a development machine certificate for localhost. And there's just a command inside of PBI Viz to go ahead and install that. And then you create new projects. Okay, now you can look at the files inside. And note that we have a package.json file. So here are the packages that are automatically installed. And one thing I note is that they have automatically, with the latest version, automatically installed D3, which they weren't doing before. Okay. Also, there is a PBI Viz file, and this file becomes the manifest for your visual. So you can see, you could fill that in inside there. Now, once I've compiled and I did a PBI Viz start, this thing starts running. And how do we test that? Let's go to Power BI. And what's kind of strange is that Power BI has this developer visual, and it works if PBI Viz is running a local copy on the same machine that you're running the browser in. Okay, what the heck am I talking about? Let me go and create a new report. I create a new report, and I look over it, and I want the developer visual. Now, note that the developer visual is not on by default. You have to turn the developer visual on. But once you've done that, let's go back and create our new report. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add this in place. And you can kind of see that it's kind of working already to some degree. Now, I want to make a couple changes right here. So if I go back and kind of look at the visual itself, there's a lot of junk inside there. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of do a quick replace that with something I've already written. So I'm going to go back to my other sample, which is called my first visual. And I'm just going to basically take this code inside here, and I'm just going to open this with Notepad. And is this the right one? Okay, one second. Just trying to verify that I'm using the right one inside there. Okay, well, I'll know in a second. Okay, somehow I'm not using the correct one right here, but I guess it shouldn't really matter if I just kind of finish off by here kind of is my visual. And as I work with the visual, let's say that I get rid of, what we have up here. And I know what I can do. Okay, just about out of time, but I'm going to dig down into a place I know I have a copy of this. And I think this is it right here. And now let's go back over here and kind of put hello world inside there. Okay, so as we work with V3 of the tools, you can see that we're using import statements, and there is this API that we're pulling things out of. Okay, let's go ahead and hit save inside here. Note that when you create a visual for Power BI, you create classes, and your classes inherit or implement a iVisual interface, and then you implement a constructor, your one-time initialization instructions, and then you have an update method that fires every time something interesting happens. So in our case right here, let's go back over here. Let's go ahead and do a refresh. And note that update doesn't fire at first until you add at least one field into this well inside here. Once you've done that, all of a sudden, this update method starts firing. Okay, so here I simply have some code that is, basically when the size of the visual changes, it just re-renders some things. But now there's also this other file, which is a visual.less file. And so here is a CSS file. However, let's say I do something like put ellipse. If I have an ellipse, I want the background color, which is called fill, to be orange. And let's go ahead and hit save. And now that I've compiled that, we'll go back and save. So the less file has CSS that just basically gets compiled, right into your visuals output. Okay, now I don't imagine I got very far into either SharePoint Framework or Power BI custom visuals, but the point is that if you're going to use either of these frameworks, understanding Node.js, being able to install and manage Node.js packages, and run whatever debugging tool that you're going to be using. What debugging tools did we see, this 1 hour? And first I used Browser Sync, and then I used the Webpack Dev Server. When we use SharePoint Framework, we call Gulp Serve, and they've got some set of Gulp tasks that start up their own web server. And then when I did Power BI custom visual development, we had PBI Viz. So within 1 hour, we kind of saw a pretty good variety of different things that we can work with Node.js. Once again, let me remind you that all the code examples that I showed inside of this repository, gives you the slides, but more importantly, any one of these projects, you can just open up as a top-level folder. Once you've installed Node.js, open them up in Visual Studio Code, do an npm install, and then run the commands to kind of test them out.